Welcome to the Lovecraft Easing videocast and podcast. And well, I don't know if that first part came over. So welcome to the Lovecraft Easing videocast and podcast. Today is March the 12th, 2017. Got a fun show today. We're going to talk about Doctor Who, Lovecraftian influences in Doctor Who, and use that as an excuse to talk about Doctor Who. So why don't we do introductions and name the prizes, and then we can jump right in. Matt, you have a prize?
Hi, I'm Matt Carpenter. I am currently editing a book for Oldflower Press called Pickman's Gallery. The prize today is a really wonderful anthology called Heroes of Red Hook. It was part of Golden Goblin's Kickstarter project. We have a nice paperback anthology for the lucky winner.
All right, thanks. And from Dennis Wheeler at Fedogan and Bremer, I've got a copy of Awaiting Strange Gods by Daryl Schweitzer and Darkness, My Old Friend by John Pelan, P-E-L-A-N. Hope I'm saying his last name right. So we got 3 prizes to give away today. If I had a Doctor Who book, I'd give that away, but I don't. Why don't we do introductions, and let's start with Corey and work our way over. Corey, just give us a short introduction. Tell us about yourself.
Hi there. My name is Corey Herndon. I am a fantasy and science fiction writer and a game writer. I'm currently working on a project called a PC game called Dauntless, and I am also a Doctor Who enthusiast.
Oh, look at that sonic screwdriver. That's great.
Actually, yeah.
All right, Joe.
I'm Joe Pulver, writer, editor, and currently the mayor of Carcosa.
Matt. I don't know what happened to Matt. Rick.
I'm Rick Lay. I'm writer and a longtime Doctor Who fan.
SP.
SP Miskowski. I write fiction, and I'm here to learn more about Doctor Who.
Salome.
I'm Salome Jones. I'm acquisitions editor at Ghostwoods Books, and I know something about Doctor Who.
And your husband is here, Tim.
And my
Tim,
husband is here.
Yeah, why don't you do your introduction, Tim?
Hi, I'm Tim Dodopoulos. I'm a writer, editor, game designer, and the managing editor of Ghostwoods Books. And as you can hear, I'm British. I grew up with Doctor Who. This stuff is in my bones.
Give us with Lovecraft Easing, editor, publisher, writer. So, Rick, we're going to start with Lovecraftian influences in Doctor Who. Where do you want to start? With the classic series, with the new series, with books?
I'll start with the classic series, and when a lot of these concepts cross over into the latest series, the second series.
Guys, jump in anytime, but yeah, go ahead, Rick.
But I just want to give a little background on how I got into Doctor Who. Just
okay.
How the first time any of us in America heard of Doctor Who was in 1965. When there was a Peter Cushing movie called Doctor Who and the Daleks. Now, Peter Cushing did not play Doctor Who on television. That was an actor named William Hartnell, but he played the movie version. And then they made another one called Dalek Invasion Earth 2150 AD. And I saw those probably around 68 on television. And I was watching this show and I'm going, why is this time machine shaped like a police box? And why is it big on the inside and small on the outside?
Right.
And we'll later get, because the movies are a little different, and we'll later get into how they differ from the TV series. But then in about 1970, the third Doctor in the TV series, Don Pertwee, his episodes started to creep into the United States. Now, unfortunately, they weren't syndicated in New York, which is where I lived. But when I used to visit my grandmother in New Jersey, I could catch some of them. And so I saw a few of them there. And then finally, Tom Baker came to New York. At least the Tom Baker series came to New York on a local station. And that's how I got into Doctor Who. And did a lot of reading because I was wondering, because in the first episode, he goes from being John Pertwee to Tom Baker. And I'm going, how does that happen? So I did a lot of reading on it. I think I read every paperback that they published because we weren't getting the early episodes for a long while. And I've been following the series religiously since. But now we'll get into Lovecraftian influences.
Sure.
I think the most Lovecraftian concept, at least in my opinion, is a concept that began in an episode called the Silurians, where there were these prehistoric races that lived on Earth. They weren't from outer space. This is sort of like what they're doing now with Godzilla and King Kong. There were these reptilian, dinosaur-like humanoids who had gone into hibernation when I think the explanation they gave was that a meteor was going to hit the Earth. And then they were waking up and suddenly finding out, boy, the apes have moved in and there goes the neighborhood. And they want to get back what's theirs. And they were presented somewhat sympathetically. They were one of the few sympathetic aliens on the show. And the plots usually were the Doctor wanted to negotiate with them. And it was always some militant faction that on both the human and the Silurian side that was screwing things up, and he would end up destroying them, unfortunately.
Oh, and it's interesting too that the Silurians carried through to the new series as well.
Right.
I mean, and are still. I mean, they kicked around with David Tennant's Doctor, and then the Paternoster gang, the Sherlock Holmesian trio with with Strax and everything. She's a Silurian as well, I think, who inexplicably set up shop in Victorian London as a detective.
She's a Silurian.
Because that makes perfect sense, yeah.
Now, just to go into how there were actually 3 Silurian races. Mm-hmm. The first ones had 3 eyes. They're like an eye in the middle of the forehead. And they look like guys in suits, because the budget wasn't that good. They look like guys in monster costumes is the best way I can put it when they had them. Now, then they introduced a underwater branch of the family, which we called sea devils, who were a little sort of like the deep ones in a way in Lovecraft. And they had them, and initially you just had the sea devils without the regular Silurians. And then they had a team up. It was about the 5th Doctor, Peter Davison, fought both of them. And that was another one where he tried to negotiate a truce, and it ended up turning out very badly, and everybody died almost in that episode.
Was that the one with where Adric got hit by a meteor, or Adric was on a meteor, or something?
No, that was the Cybermen.
Oh, that was the Cybermen. Okay. I couldn't show it was the Silurians.
Since you brought that up, we'll just mention that we later found out that the reason, they didn't mention the Silurians in this episode, but the reason the Silurians went into hibernation was because another alien race, the Cybermen, who was sort of like the Borg on Star Trek,
right, on Mondas,
influenced that. They wanted to destroy the Earth with a meteor, and the Doctor sent it back in time, and it ended up wiping out all the dinosaurs and causing the Silurians, by extension, to go into hibernation. That was not raised in that episode. The one was Peter Davison and the Silurians involved nuclear. They were trying to cause a nuclear war between the equivalents of America and the Soviet Union in the future.
A question for you guys, because I'm not an expert on Doctor Who. I love Doctor Who, the new series. I've watched very little of the classic series. Listened to a couple of the audiobooks. So there are some very good audiobooks, by the way. But so I did a little bit of research for this show. Knew I didn't have to do much because I knew you experts would be here. But the little research I did, there's a hell of a lot of Lovecraftian influences in Doctor Who, which for me begs the question, and I'd like your opinion on it, guys. Is Doctor Who in a Lovecraftian universe, or are there just a hell of a lot of Lovecraftian type of beings and influences and so forth?
I go as the latter.
Okay.
If the other people agree.
Well, it's interesting. I was looking for references to Lovecraft actually on the show because, you know, sometimes, especially in the audios, he's actually like met Sherlock Holmes or in some of the fiction, and sometimes Sherlock Holmes is a fictional character. And Paul McGann's doctor in one of the audios talked about meeting Lovecraft, like briefly, as one of those he was very big on name dropping and talking about the famous people that he'd met. So by that measure, he literally is in a universe in which Lovecraft exists and is a writer. But there's clearly a ton of in the novels, especially the in-between novels between the original series and the new one. There's a lot of real actual name dropping of the actual old ones. Like you talked about the Silurians as a really Lovecraftian feature on Doctor Who, but I was thinking almost immediately of the Great Intelligence, which was part of the Patrick Troughton years with Web of Fear and the Snowmen, because of course the Great Intelligence's plans involve robotic Yetis, of course, because it's Doctor Who. But this character came back and inhabited Richard E. Grant and was voiced by Ian McKellen and fought Matt Smith, and in the form of a snowman, right? And meanwhile, in the novels, in between both series, he was actually name dropped as Yog Sothoth. I'm probably going to totally.
Yeah, that was in a novel called The All-Consuming Fire.
And so that's just straight up, inserting the Who universe right on into the mythos, as far as I can tell. So I don't know, it's kind of like it's about 90% one and 10% the other. It feels
maybe we just.
I think that the Doctor wouldn't be able to answer that question with any great authority. There's a lot of really strange stuff that goes on in the Doctor Who universe, and the stuff that we see on the end of it is very much filtered as a show for kids and adults, family friendly. It's all fairly good-natured. The Doctor's always, a cheerful, genial hero, blah blah blah. But there's a lot of darkness between the lines. And I don't see any problem with the Great Old Ones fitting into that sort of space at all. And in fact, you could almost see the Doctor himself as a sort of avatar of Nyarlathotep sometimes, because he's leaping around through time, causing chaos, destroying entire civilizations sometimes. And he's doing it, with these little easily corrupted teenagers that he drags along with him. These acolytes.
They keep him grounded, man. Keep him honest. It's not weird. It's not weird.
It's a very small cult.
Did anybody here watch Sarah Jane Smith's spin-off series?
Yeah.
I
watched a few.
Yeah. Well, wasn't
which one? Do you mean K9 and Company, or do you mean
the second one?
Yeah, the one she was doing with that actually crossed over with the Davis series, right?
Right, but I'm just saying the trickster in that they had a recurring villain called the Trickster was very much like Nyarlathotep. He was almost faceless. He had like half a face, sort of. He had like a mouth but no eyes. And he was a very demonic entity. And he always reminded me of Nyarlathotep.
Yeah. Also, there's this thing, particularly with the new series now, of this kind of impossible vortex of all time and space lurking deep inside the heart of the TARDIS. And no one so far has really given us any clue of what that actually means. It's not difficult to see that as Azathoth.
Could be.
I mean, obviously I'm reaching.
Yeah.
Because there's nothing in the show or the books that would lead you in that direction. But if you look for possible Lovecraftiana hidden behind the strand of the Doctor, I think it's quite possible to see him drawing on the power of Azathoth to manipulate the universe for his own ends. And that's generally beneficial to England in particular. But, hey, we're always the evil ones.
Or New York.
If Hollywood's told me anything, it's that the British are evil.
Oh?
Just to get back to, before I go to the next Lovecraftian, I just want to say, since I was on the Solarians, what happened was makeup got better for this series. So now they have 2 eyes, and they look very human, like that Sherlock Holmes detective that you were talking about, Gary.
Yeah, but God, I'm drawing a blank on her name. Lady Vastra, I think?
Something like that.
Yeah.
She wears a veil, and she's she's in a human gay relationship.
Yes, and also has the crossover with Holmes, and that when she's initially being introduced, the voiceover implies that they're introducing you to Sherlock Holmes, or maybe even the Doctor impersonating Holmes, and it turns out to be her, and with her son Taran Butler, who is Dan Starkey is just awesome. He works all over Big Finish too, the company that does the Doctor Who audios, because since Centauruns are all clones, he plays all of them.
So Taurans are not Lovecraftian, but they're fun. They all get at different points in history. They're all played by the same actor.
Right.
It's just which actor's available then.
They kind of look like potatoes in armor.
I can't remember the name of it, but I listened to a while back a David Tennant. David Tennant read it, an audiobook, and he and Rose land on this beach, and mayhem ensues. Do you remember what that was, Rick?
Oh, I'm not into the audio drama, so I wouldn't know.
Okay, I'll look it up while you guys are talking. What are a few?
It may have been an actual audio book instead of one of the full cast dramas. There were 3 Tennant full cast dramas, but they were all with Donna Noble. So if it was with Rose, he might have been reading one of the licensed novels, maybe.
Or it might be one of those.
I know that he was. It was a licensed novel. Now that you mention it, yeah, he was reading it.
Okay.
It was not an audio drama, but I just remember it as being very good.
Now, when they had John Pertwee was the 3rd Doctor, which, just to give a little background on that version of the Doctor, he was marooned on Earth for a long while. Of course, we'll go into the Time Lords a little later, but the Time Lords had turned against him, or were punishing him for stealing the TARDIS to begin with. I think that was it. And John Pertwee was working with the United Nations Intelligence Task Force, which is UNIT. So it was very much a traditional science fiction series in those years, more like the Quatermass, is that how you say it, movies? Guess so.
I think so. I mean, Tim might know better.
Yeah. He's nodding his head.
Yeah, it's Quatermass.
So it was more like those, if you ever seen the Creeping Unknown. It's called the Creeping Unknown in the United States, rather than Quatermass in the Pit. No, excuse me, Quatermass Experiment. In the UK, it's Quatermass Experiment and Quatermass 2 and Quatermass in the Pit. And there's Quatermass Conclusion. There was all of them. So he was fighting alien threats. And this actually goes back before Pertwee to Patrick Troughton, who was the first comedic Doctor Who. They did 3 takes on the sinking of Atlantis that totally contradicted each other. And in Patrick Troughton's era, it was an episode called The Underwater Menace, where Atlantis sinks beneath the sea, and all the humanoids on the surface of the continent seem to evolve into something resembling a deep one. And they want to bring the landmass back up to the surface, and that's going to like wipe out the UK and probably most of Europe if they do so. And then when Pertwee came along, he had two other explanations for the sinking of Atlantis that were very Lovecraftian. The first was called the Demons, in which there were these horned aliens who had visited Earth and taught humankind certain elder sciences. And the Doctor has an archenemy called the Master, who's from the same alien race called the Time Lords. And the Master was trying to contact one of the demons to get some powers from him to conquer Earth and whatever other planet he wants to go after. And they briefly just dropped in passing that this demon, his name was Azael, which is an actual demon in Christian demonology, had destroyed Atlantis because they ticked him off for whatever reason. And then there was another one called, I think it was the Time Monster. It had a monster named Kronos, which was sort of like a Hound of Daedalus, except it was a bird. But it was something that traveled the passages of time and was a predator. And they ended up going to Atlantis, and it chased them there, and it ended up destroying Atlantis. But Atlantis stopped being in the Atlantic Ocean and was now in the Mediterranean. It was sort of like the theory that Atlantis was based on the early civilizations of Crete, and it had King Minos from Greek mythology. It had the Minotaur in it, played by David Prowse, who's probably best known for being the body of Darth Vader. And it had Ingrid Pitt from Vampire Lovers and The House That Dripped Blood, which she had also made with John Pertwee, who plays the Third Doctor. So we had three explanations for Atlantis that made no sense. And luckily they haven't, well, at least made no sense in that they contradicted each other, but luckily they haven't given us a fourth or fifth in the future seasons.
Well, there might be some more turning up in the audios. Hey, do you know, did those demons have any relation to the Nymon eventually? Were they related to those at all? Because these guys look totally Minotaur-y. They were from the Horns of Nymon. Yeah, because they turned up. I was listening to an audio recently in which they turned up again. I think it was a Sixth Doctor audio.
You had you had the Horns of Nymon, which was Tom Baker, and then it was, they didn't call them Nymon, but they said they were related. You had that. I'm trying to think. Was it a David Tennant episode where they were trapped in some sort of hotel and there was this Minotaur-like creature?
No, that was I think that was a Smith episode, because wasn't that the one with the that crazy? He was opening up all the hotel doors and there were like crazy scenes in there, and then yeah, that was Smith. I'm pretty sure. I can't remember what episode that was, but yeah, you're right. I remember them mentioning that those were Nymon, similar to
Nymon. At the end they said it was a member of this, so and so. They're sort of cousins of the Nymon or something like that.
Yeah, that's cool. I love.
Corey, you mentioned in the comments, you mentioned a bundle of Doctor Who audios.
Oh yeah,
you want to tell the audience about that real quick before I forget?
Sure. I really, for the last several years, I've really been enjoying the Doctor Who audios from Big Finish, which are kind of the majority of them are full cast dramas, and they do a lot of stuff other than Doctor Who as well. And I don't work for them or anything. I'm just a fan. But they also do more audiobook style stories in which one of the characters will generally narrate what happened. And so Humble Bundle is doing a Humble audiobook bundle that has kind of a mix of these things. There's a series called Destiny of the Doctor, which are more like narrated stories. They have a bunch of lost stories from the Tom Baker era. They actually have Tom Baker in his 80s doing audio stories still that are new audio stories. You can get some of those. There's some Eighth Doctor stuff with Paul McGann, and then for over $15, it looks like they're also offering even more Tom Baker stuff, and Torchwood. They've started doing Torchwood stories, which includes John Barrowman and the rest of the cast of that show. There's probably the one of most interest to new series viewers. They have a series that is called The Churchill Years, which has the guy who played Churchill on during the Matt Smith run a couple of seasons ago. Ian McNeice doing Winston Churchill with various Doctor Who related stories there, yeah, it's a pretty cool introduction to the Doctor Who audios, and it's also money goes to charity, so humble bundles are always good for that, and yeah, I definitely recommend if anyone's interested in getting into these, or if you apparently they also have an add-on for the Doctor Who Legacy game. Also, it's worth mentioning, if you have Spotify, you can hear...
before you get into that, that's at humblebundle.com.
Yeah, humblebundle.com.
And then I would assume they could just search for Doctor Who. So.
Search for Doctor Who.
Sorry,
sorry, I keep going too fast.
Yeah, so what were you saying?
If you're not interested in spending any money at all, and you have a computer, you can go to Spotify and listen to the first 50 of the main range Doctor Who stories, which star Doctors 5, 6, 7, and 8. So that's Peter Davison, Colin Baker, Sylvester McCoy, and Paul McGann doing kind of rotating cycles of stories that are all really of varying levels of quality. Some of them are amazingly good. There's one, number 40 is especially great. It's called Jubilee. It's a six Doctor story written by Robert Shearman, and who also wrote the script for a Ninth Doctor episode called Dalek, which was kind of based on that. So yeah, you can hear all those. And they have a bunch of their other stuff up too. They do some Sherlock Holmes stories themselves. They do spin-off characters from Doctor Who, and a lot of those are available on Spotify. And if you have Spotify Premium, you can download them and take them around and listen to them on the bus like I do.
Awesome. That's a lot of content.
It is. It's funny, if you really, just by sheer terms of story count, Paul McGann has had more stories than any of the other Doctors, and yet he's only had 2 visual appearances in the medium, and including a lot of stuff
I thought he made a great Doctor.
He really did, and he's audio-wise, he's fantastic, and a lot of his stuff does veer into really dark places. In fact, I was going to say, we were talking about darkness, Lovecraftian influences. The audio realm has a real advantage, I think, in depicting some of this stuff, because in some of the stories I've heard, he gets pit up against, some literal Lovecraftian type creatures, but also just really dark and scary kind of are they ghosts or are they not kind of stories that were really enjoyable. There's one called Chimes of Midnight. That's a Paul McGann story that is really, really well done. Sort of a haunted house motif that's set around Christmas time. And that one's also on Spotify if you want to just listen to it. And I'm sorry, I could talk about Big Finish stuff the whole time, so I don't want to. I don't want to take the whole,
the thing with Big Finish is, I listened to the Dark Shadows audios, which are great. The thing was, when I discovered them, I said, they have tons of Doctor Who audios. It's sort of like, if I start on it, besides bankrupting me,
yeah.
At this point, I've spent a lot on other things, so it really is not a question of price. But it's so much.
Yeah, I take advantage of sales, and I've been leaning on Spotify an awful lot. I mean, the Spotify collections are really the fact that they're even there and that you can listen to them for free is really kind of amazing. I never would have caught up that, because they're well over 200 stories in the main range now, the monthly range, with Doctors 4 through 7 now. McGann doesn't do them anymore now that he's got his own series. In fact, because they're bringing in the Time War, they have the license to do new series stuff now too. So that's why, like, David Tennant had his own box set of stories set during the Donna Noble years. They haven't gotten Smith yet, or Capaldi, but I could totally see Capaldi doing it after, when his time comes.
Smith has definitely read a couple of straight-up audiobooks.
Oh yes, definitely. He hasn't actually played. Neither he nor Eccleston have actually played the character in a drama, though, that I've been able to find. Tennant is the only one who's actually done that from the new show. But yeah, Capaldi being Capaldi, though, I wouldn't put it past him to do it eventually. Tennant had a previous history with Big Finish. He played a Nazi in I think episode 25 of the main range, which is a Seventh Doctor and Ace story where they go to a Nazi prison, Colditz prison, and Tennant plays an evil, slimy Nazi before he ever got cast as the 10th Doctor. Because they started in, I want to say, the late 90s or around 2000 or so. So Big Finish was doing stuff for, I want to say, 4 or 5 years before the new series started. And they even, if you listen to the stuff on Spotify, they go all the way up to basically the 40th anniversary of Doctor Who. They have a bunch of linked stories that cover like the Master and Davros and what's his name, Omega. Or Omega, I should say.
But you want to just say who Omega is for those who don't know him?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Omega is one of the ancient Time Lords who, along with Lord Rassilon, helped give time travel to the Time Lords and establish them as a time-traveling culture. And he ended up, as part of the experiments, he ended up flung into an antimatter universe where he was trapped on his ship for forever, and then he crossed over and met the Fourth Doctor, and they honestly, I'm a little sketchy on the details. It's been a while since I've seen it, but he has a great big evil like Cylon Pope hat, if you can imagine it, and a really great voice actor, because you don't really ever get to see him, and for some reason everyone in the show doesn't say Omega as they say Omega, like Omaha. Which was kind of fun. Anyway, he also gets explored a lot in the audios. There's an entire one dedicated to him trying to cross over from the other universe. He's, according to, now check me on this, I think he and the Doctor and Rassilon actually, like, it's implied that the Doctor may have actually been around back then too, in a few stories, as the other or whatever. There were 3 guys.
Well, let's just modify some things you said. It wasn't the Fourth Doctor. It was the first 3 Doctors who fought him the first time.
Oh, right, in the Death Zone or whatever, right? I'm sorry.
The serial called the 3 Doctors. They got the first 3 Doctors to fight him. So that was William Hartnell, Patrick Troughton, and John Pertwee. That was the first Doctor team up.
Hartnell was trapped in a time eddy, right? So,
because he was gravely ill at the time, so we couldn't really. It was mainly Troughton and Pertwee. Mm-hmm. And then he came back in the Peter Davison episode. And then they had a Dalek serial with Sylvester McCoy, the 7th Doctor, where they had the hand of Omega.
Right.
Daleks were trying to steal it.
Right. Which was basically something that could destroy a star. Was that the idea? The hand of...
Yeah, it was something like it causes a black hole or whatever. Mm-hmm. That was when they destroyed Scarrow, and it was the plan of the Daleks for the upteenth time in Skez.
Yeah.
But how many times they destroy Scarrow, it comes back somehow.
Well, yeah, because it was there. It obviously had come back by the time the Doctor Who TV movie came out and introduced Paul McGann, because the Master had for some reason been tried by the Daleks and handed over to the Doctor. No, it made almost no sense. I mean, it's really, if they hadn't cast Sylvester McCoy as the previous Doctor, it would have been really weird to tie that into the continuity at all. But there he was. So clearly he was the 7th Doctor with long hair.
But that episode, just to go into the Doctor's past, that episode implied that he was around with Rassilon and Omega.
Right.
And but they've never gone into that. And since we keep bringing up the Paul McGann movie, whatever happened to the idea that one of his parents was human?
Well, I've heard that it's been explained away a number of ways.
He's interested in Earth for some reason,
Well, that's true, but I think the implication, I think it was actually somewhat implied that he was basically just saying that. It was just a joke or a gag or something. They tried to hand wave it away that way, but it seems like there's been ample opportunity to go ahead and work that into the continuity. I'm not really sure why they don't, unless they're trying not to contradict some other stuff with.
Well, we know humans can marry Time Lords because the 4th Doctor had an assistant named Leela, who's sort of a female Tarzan, and she ended up staying in Gallifrey and marrying a Time Lord.
and ends up in an audio series with Romana, or they're hanging out on Gallifrey actually. They've she stayed on Gallifrey, married, and there's obviously ample evidence that there was some type of romantic relationship between Ten and Rose at some point, whether any of that was official. But yeah, I'm trying to remember how they actually. I think that really was the only way they got rid of it, was by just saying it was a gag. But yeah, it seems like there was also plenty of ways they could have worked around that.
Well,
it would definitely explain his interest in Earth, which out of all the planets, why that one?
I do think nation. So many planets out there.
Mm-hmm.
Why is he obsessed with Earth?
Yeah, I think
there was a novel actually, which didn't feature the Doctor. It featured that schoolboy who used to be a companion to Peter Davidson. Turlo, I think.
Adric? Oh, Turlo, yeah. He was the one who was trying to secretly kill him or something.
Yeah, I think there were. It was either. Well, I may be wrong here. It wasn't Turlo. It was Harry Sullivan. It was one of these companion books, and they had some explanation for why Earth was constantly being invaded. It was like there was something in the center of the Earth which was important, or something.
Oh well, God, that's just like Atlantis. There have been so many things in the center of the Earth, and again, if you want to get Lovecraftian, how about the Rachnos? The giant spider crab woman who lives in the center of the Earth and who has apparently filled it with eggs. Apparently, just in the same way that the moon is an egg for a giant dragon, which that's a whole nother story. The Earth is filled with spider eggs. that David Tennant got really angry and drowned alive, if memory serves. The Rachnos were a hell of a great makeup job, though. Do you remember them from the David Tennant era?
Yeah, I remember.
I can't remember what episode
Donna Noble.
Yes.
That one, right?
Yeah.
That's we first go into who was the Doctor and who was the companion.
Mm-hmm. Right. Until they end up swapping brains and all that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, it's and that's just one thing. I swear I've heard of there being other things that were at the center of the Earth, in addition to the Rachnos, or there being other things that were a cause of Vesuvius erupting. Because that was, I think, weren't the Rachnos tied into that somehow?
They might have said that. A lot of things people forget because they say them in passing.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'm sure a lot of writers come along and maybe aren't familiar with the entire every single episode of every single series and may not realize that somebody else used this event or someone else has used Atlantis, or they just didn't care because they thought it was just a kid's show and no one would keep track of it obsessively.
Well, does Tim remember the two explanations for the Loch Ness monster?
Oh,
the Zygons were responsible for it, and then they had a Colin Baker episode where it was where they had H.G. Wells was Colin Baker, and they had some half reptilian, half human scientist who gets thrown into Loch Ness.
That's awesome.
So there were two Loch Ness monsters in the Doctor Who universe. Right. I always like to think the scientists got eaten by the one that was much larger, which the Zygons controlled.
He was like a robot of theirs or something, wasn't it? Or a drone?
He was a robot.
Yeah.
Well, the Zygons were one of those. The Zygons were one of the best aliens from when they didn't have an expensive makeup budget.
And hey, how about give the BBC some credit for keeping that look pretty much intact when they brought them back for the Capaldi crossover. Well, actually, were they around in Day of the Doctor too? Tim, do you remember?
They were mentioned.
Yeah, but there was that they
were in Day of the Doctor. Yeah,
that two-parter with Capaldi had like one of the best anti-war speeches I've ever seen. But I mean, they kept them almost completely just suckers and all, like these giant weird-headed octopus things. I love Zygons. They look so angry.
I think Joe has a question for Tim, a Doctor Who question for Tim, I think.
Yeah, I was just curious because you're a Brit and you grew up with Doctor Who, and all the postings I see on social media, especially the last couple of years, and especially with people from the UK, Doctor Who seems to be unbelievably beloved. What was when the show started early on? Did it get popular quick?
It took them a while. It took them a while to warm up to it. The original thought that they had for it was to try and make it a scientific thing, like a way of introducing useful educational concepts about prehistory and possible futures to the younger generations. But the character had its own momentum, and it gathered backstory and attention. And I think it was when they switched to Troughton, and you had to bring in this whole thing about regeneration and start actually going into the Time Lords and so on, that the mythology really started branching out, and that's when it started to attract attention. But it was Pertwee who really made it popular, because Pertwee had been a spy during the Second World War. Honest to goodness, not really, no one's James Bond. There is no James Bond, but he'd been an actual intelligence agent, and he wanted the Doctor to be more hands-on and all kung fu and stuff. And that kind of element of just that dash of high camp sprinkled over the top was, I think, what really started to make it resonant with people. And it certainly, by the time that I was sort of entering my secondary school, I don't really know how that corresponds to American education systems. Your education system's weird to me. But, when I was 10, 11, stuff like that,
school, I think.
It had become a sort of cultural touchstone, really. Even quite a lot of cool kids, jocks, rich kids, the kind you'd normally find leading cliques, even they kind of knew about it. They didn't necessarily watch it, but they knew enough about it to know what the TARDIS was and what a Dalek was and so on. And as we've all grown up, these children of the 70s were really weird in UK. A lot of television was very, very strange. And that's where the whole Hookland stuff comes from. But as we grew up, we kind of carried that strangeness with us. And it sort of, now it has definitely become, a core part of the British national psyche. You could stick a blue police box on the street in any city, any town in England, and people would go, "What? Doctor Who? Where's the Doctor?" Everyone knows.
The Daleks really saved the original series, from what I understand.
The Daleks were a work of absolute visual genius. It's how do you take what's effectively the Nazis and turn them into something that is the complete antithesis of anything that you'd expect to see as a natural creature? It's like this crazy pepper pot upside down on rollers with a sink plunger and a broomstick, and just the design and the voice and the implacability. They were a fantastic, fantastic creation. They were also supposed to be a big villain in Blake 7 originally, if any of you know Blake 7.
Yeah, Terry Nation.
Yeah, Blake 7 was originally part of the Doctor Who universe, and the big enemy in Blake 7 was going to be the Daleks. But the BBC went, no, you can't do that. We want it compartmentalized, and slapped his wrist, and it became, random space aliens and stuff.
Well, one of the weird things that you're bringing up now is that if you create something for Doctor Who, the writer owns the rights to that character. And they've got to negotiate with you or contract with you to keep using it. And
it depends on the contract.
Yeah, and during that period, when the show was canceled from most of the 90s, there were all these little independent producers who were buying characters from Doctor Who and making direct-to-video movies was the Brigadier or whomever.
Really?
In fact, there's one called Downtime, which it used to be on YouTube, but they took it off for copyright reasons. It had Unit was the Brigadier. It was the first episode to introduce the fact that he had a daughter. It wasn't played by the actress who plays her now, but that's where his daughter became canon. And it had him battling the alien intelligence with all the original Yeti robots. And if
are there episodes of Doctor Who on YouTube?
There are probably at least clips.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I don't know if there's full episodes. There's I want to say there's a service or something called Daily Motion, maybe, that has some episodes, which I have no idea if that is actually authorized. But if you have, I don't know if you can get it in Germany, if you can get Amazon streaming, but the new series is at least on Amazon Prime. But all the old stuff used to be on Hulu, but now it's all gone, unfortunately.
I was just curious if there was anything free online for people who aren't into it, or looking to get deeper into it. That's all.
Well,
speaking of the old series, I have a question for you guys. Let's say you've got someone like me who's seen the series since 2005 and loves it, which I do. And I've not seen much of the classic series at all, and by that I mean very little. What do you think are some of the best episodes or time periods to watch, as opposed to watching it from? There's an awful lot to watch. Where would you start?
Genesis of the Daleks introduces Davros.
That's a good one. That's a real good one. In fact, in Fourth Doctor era, if you're looking for just an era to get into, I think Fourth Doctor is pretty accessible. That's Tom Baker. The first full Tom Baker series I watched is called City of Death, which is from a brief period where Douglas Adams of Hitchhiker's Guide, etc., was the story editor and was actually writing a lot of scripts for them. He wrote City of Death, Pirate Planet, this famous unfilmed thing called Shalka. Shada. Yeah, sorry, Shalka was later. Shada, and I know he had his hands on some other scripts too. And I want to say that Dirk Gently, I read, started off as a Doctor Who script that never got made. But City of Death is super accessible for a new series viewer. I think it's not very connected to any other real continuity or anything. It's a really fun, fast-moving story. It's shot in Paris, and they let you know it every single time they possibly can by having the Doctor and Romana run around across Paris. And the bad guy is Julian Glover from The Last Crusade and Game of Thrones and so many other things. It's funny. It's the very first classic series episode I ever saw when I was a little kid, and I had only seen Star Wars and stuff with Dykstra ILM level effects, and I just could not wrap my brain around what people saw in this weird videotaped show. But I do vividly remember seeing is Skaroth, something like that. Skaroth of the Jagaroth, standing there in his nice suit with his broccoli head because he had just turned back into an alien. And that just freaked me the hell out when I was a little kid. But I think that's a really accessible series for one, and I think probably Baker's is a pretty accessible era. If you really want to go deep, a lot of the Second Doctor's stuff, I think it feels weirdly fresh and new. But a lot of it got recycled by the BBC, so not all of it is available. But one of them that is Tomb of the Cybermen, which is just a really great Cybermen story, and really has this creepy, frozen, almost has a zombie movies in space kind of feel.
It's a mummy movie in space.
Yeah, it's a mummy movie. It's totally, and makes great use of Saran wrap, like probably the scariest use of Saran wrap I've ever seen. So now those are just some ideas. As far as Joe was talking, though, a place you can actually download this stuff free or watch it for a subscription or something, I honestly don't know. I think it might just be, you might just have to find DVDs now, or just buy full episodes on iTunes. Some stuff that was recently found in a vault somewhere were some of those Patrick Troughton episodes. And so there's Web of Fear, which is one of the great intelligence episodes where the Lovecraftian ancient intelligence occupies a bunch of robotic yetis and unleashes them on the underground. That is almost complete now, and you can actually buy it on iTunes. But
well, go ahead, Rick. I'm sorry.
Since you brought up the Cybermen, and if you've seen there's a trailer which got released and then taken back.
Yes, I've seen it.
Okay. This one thing we're talking about, keeping makeup. We have this race called the Cybermen, which are kind of like the Borg. In fact, the Borg was really sort of a ripoff in a way of the Cybermen, though done with better makeup.
And they didn't get turned into a hive mind, a bunch of space wasps either. They maintained their. Yeah.
But Cybermen are humans who have been turned into robots and brainwashed, and their appearance has changed throughout the decades. And whenever their appearance changes, it's suddenly like all of previous history is erased, because wherever the Doctor runs into them, they're the new version. In fact, they had the sixth Doctor go back to the tomb, which the second Doctor had discovered, and they all had been upgraded while they were in hibernation.
Yeah, it's like Klingon forehead ridges.
Exactly.
But just if you saw the recent trailer that got pulled back, they had a first level Cyberman from William Hartnell era.
Mondasian Cybermen.
Yes, so maybe we'll get the origin. We got an origin for a parallel world version of Cybermen,
and
crossed over and taken over all the other Cybermen.
And Big Finish did a Cybermen origin story with Peter Davison. That is kind of it's called Spare Parts, and it's actually set. He arrives on Mondas before the Cybermen conversion. But they're kind of starting to get there. They're starting to modify themselves. They have cybernetic pets and they have pet cybermats and stuff. It's a really good story, but he faces that same kind of dilemma he faces in Genesis of the Daleks, which is, basically, do you go back and kill Hitler in the crib, or do you let history play out as it is? Because, this bad guy has affected so many things. And I think he ends up, making the same decision that the Doctor made in Genesis, which is go ahead and, go ahead and let the space Nazis evolve, because, eventually they'll have so much influence on the timeline that he can't get rid of them.
Now, as a favor for Joe, there is a major Marvel Comics influence on Doctor Who. I'm going to describe something. I'm going to ask him what it reminds him of. In Doctor Who, the Time Lords are a race which has the power to change, travel throughout time, is the most advanced race in the universe. And one time, according to an episode called Underworld, they shared this technology with a lesser race, which used it to blow up their planet. And then they made an oath, which they would later violate going down the road. But for a long while, they had an oath never to interfere in anything, just to observe history. Who does that sound like, Joe?
The Watcher.
Yeah, they borrowed the whole concept of the Watcher for the Time Lords.
Really?
The Watcher from Marvel?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
I love the Watcher.
Originally, when it was just non-interfere, at least they might not have borrowed the non-interference. Maybe they came up with that on their own. But when they gave an explanation for it in Underworld, it was right out of the origin story for the Watcher.
Well, speaking of Marvel and origin stories, okay, so you know how at least one of the versions of Galactus's origin is that Galactus, the Devourer of Worlds, who was depicted in the second Ioan Griffith Fantastic Four movie as a bunch of spaceships next to Warren Ellis, But yeah, Galactus was supposedly from the previous universe, and that went through a Big Bang and Big Crunch cycle, and so he's the only survivor of that previous universe. And although some versions of it also say that he and a few of the Celestials survived.
I was going to say some of the Celestials.
Yeah, and so. The Great Intelligence, since I keep beating the Great Intelligence drum, some versions of the Great Intelligence and the Great Old Ones in Who mythology were basically the previous universe's version of the Time Lords, or sometimes it's their own dimension's version of the Time Lords, but mostly I've heard it being the previous versions. And so those of them that survived into our current universe are the ones who became Yog-Sothoth and pals. Which is interesting. It makes them a natural, enemy of the Time Lords. Although I guess the vampires are their ancient enemy.
That's another one from the fourth cycle. But since you were bringing up Galactus, when they had his origin originally in Thor, now that I think about it, it's not too dissimilar to Omega. It was some scientists who went off to do this weird thing, got zapped, and they both seem to have the same sort of likeness for big headwear.
Yeah, I was gonna say I could totally see Kirby designing Omega's space boat helmet.
It was created around he was created in '73 for the 10th year anniversary, so he predates. I mean, he comes after Galactus.
Right. But definitely Kirby-esque.
Yeah, because Galactus is issue 48 of the FF.
You guys knowing Joe, and maybe people like Joe who have not seen Doctor Who at all, do you think, and maybe this is a terrible question to ask, but do you think that the 2005, the new series, is more accessible to someone who's never seen Doctor Who at all? Do you think they should start there?
Yes. I'm going to wait straight in and say,
can I just say
yes,
one thing?
absolutely.
That's really a great question, Mike, and thanks, because way back in the day when PBS was airing those initial Doctor Who shows that somebody my age, and I'm over 60, saw, what turned me off is I had already experienced Star Trek and The Outer Limits and The Twilight Zone. So those things look like these crappy old videos. And visually, they were difficult to become attached to. So Mike's question's great. Yeah, I'm real. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, what I was going to say was, if you're going to go back to classic Who, you need to have a tolerance for stage hands in rubber costumes and set walls that wobble when the actors accidentally lean on them. I mean, I grew up with it. It's part of what I love about it. It's, visually, it's very hokey. And there's no way around that. And to someone who's never had that experience, particularly of BBC stuff from the 70s and 80s, it takes a bit of getting used to. And
I'd
the
say
newer
if
stuff is
like
much
Hitchhiker's
slicker.
Guide, maybe, or first couple of seasons of Red Dwarf, they might be able to tolerate it. But
Well, yeah, sure. You have to be down with British set design on a shoestring budget, basically.
Well,
but if you start with that new series, I personally know you can start there, because that's exactly what I did.
Exactly.
And get immense enjoyment out of it.
It was one of my earliest exposures to anything British, for A. And for B, in that era, the television was not mine. I did not control it. I got to watch it periodically here and there. So when I encountered those Doctor Who episodes, they were not in order. I might see one, it might be weeks before I encountered another one. So if there was any kind of arc going on, again, there were holes, and I just, what's going on here?
Yeah.
Well, I just want to say, watching Doctor Who is like watching Dark Shadows, the original, except they don't fluff up dialogue on Doctor Who. The refilm, they would re-roll, they didn't film it almost live like they did in Dark Shadows. They would, roll back the tape if the Doctor blew a line.
Wow.
Sometimes.
Yeah, and I did love Dark Shadows. So
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an element of, the nostalgic impulse overrides a lot, especially, if it's something that you grew up with, and so it's easier for you to go back to. And so, yeah, I mean, if you're coming to it purely from the new, or from not having seen the older stuff, I think you got to either allow for other people's nostalgia coloring it while you're, hearing about it, maybe read up on it a little bit first.
Well, I mean,
Or
we're supposed to be talking
yeah.
about Lovecraft in relation to Who, right?
True.
So let's just acknowledge that
That's
for
our
a moment.
excuse for talking about it. Yes.
If you read just like one random Lovecraft story picked, out of with a dart on a dartboard, and just find a story, whatever it is, read it. It's going to seem weird. It's going to seem out of context. It's going to have those shaky cardboard walls. And something that Doctor Who had that certainly the Twilight Zone didn't, and that even to a certain extent classic Trek didn't, but which Lovecraft does, is this deep sense of mythos. There's a lot of story going on, and particularly with Terry Nation, there was a lot of very deep awareness of stuff he'd been thinking about and knitting together, and it didn't always come through into the episodes, but it's there just hanging behind the curtain. You can see its shapes moving as a foulness, shall you know them. And that's one of the things that makes Doctor Who such an enduring passion for so many people, including people here. It's that there is this huge, seamless, weird universe that you get glimpses of in these often crazy little stories, honestly. But it's not about that. It's about the whole thing. And that's a lot of why Lovecraft and the mythos always appealed to me. It's because you can see the glimpses behind the curtain of just even what's on the page. And I think that's a common strength that they both share.
Here's another question. In the last few years, I've become a stark raving fan of Mark Gatiss. I first encountered him with his horror documentaries on the history of horror film, and of course Sherlock and other things, and I've seen him as an actor as well. He's done some Doctor Who, yes.
He's written some episodes.
Oh yes, yeah. He's in a lot of ways. I think he's maybe written second only to Moffat and Davis. I mean, he's got 2 episodes in this coming up season for sure. And
I've never, in any context, and I've listened to a lot and read interviews, and like I said, I've watched both of his history of horror film documentaries. I've never once heard him utter the word Lovecraft. And I don't have any sense that he's a fan of Lovecraft. Perhaps, Tim, you're over there, you might have more exposure to Gatiss than I do. Do you know if he has any interest? Has he contributed anything Lovecraftian to Doctor Who?
I've never heard him say it out loud, but if you look back at the League of Gentlemen, his kind of, how would you describe that? Kind of modern British folk horror as a sitcom, sort of. Really weird, really dark. He's read it. He has to have read it. There's just too much strangeness going on in his head not to have come across it.
The other things, since we're going in whether Lovecraft, we've talked about how Lovecraft may have influenced Doctor Who. There's also the other way going around, at least with mythos fiction. Brian Lumley had a hero named Titus Crow, who essentially became Doctor Who, battling the Great Old Ones. They had this time clock from H.P. Lovecraft's and E. Hoffman Price's Through the Gates of the Silver Key, which was just a clock which had like a doorway, and it would zap you into another dimension or something, take you to another planet. They had Titus Crow somewhat mobilize that and make it vanish, and it was a TARDIS. It was going to Yuggoth, Lake of Howley, you name it.
Well, Lumley got that from Doctor Who, yes?
Yes.
I always assumed that, even though I hadn't seen much Doctor Who.
Right.
Well, at some points, the TARDIS's chameleon circuitry has actually worked, and it has been that kind of big clock in one episode.
Like once, right? That was a Colin Baker episode, wasn't it? Where he got it working just for one episode and then it busted again.
Yeah, I remember it was an.
And they walked out from behind it. I remember they didn't open the door and step out. They just, it was a back door.
There was no budget for a front door.
I think Matt Smith got it to work for a while too.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I as I remember, supposedly it was supposed to. The idea was that they would actually have it working, and then just decided that the police box was iconic. I don't know. That's something I read.
Yeah.
But yeah, and speaking of Gaddis, I mean, he did write. I was just looking at this to make sure my memory didn't escape me. A couple of fairly horrific episodes. The Crimson Horror, which was a Matt Smith Victorian episode with the Paternoster gang, the Silurians, that had some really creepy sort of leechy poison type of monsters involved. And he wrote an Ice Warriors episode, and the Ice Warriors are kind of like the Silurians except on Mars. They're another ancient race of reptile people who evolved on Mars, and I think managed to wipe themselves out. Or I'm sure there's actual several versions of how the Ice Warriors
they're coming back this season.
Yeah.
Since you brought them up,
yes. But
I'll tell you what they remind me of. At the Mountains of Madness and Who Goes There.
Who Goes There?
We're always finding them in the ice.
Mm-hmm.
And it was probably created by the first film version of Who Goes There, The Thing, not the John Carpenter version, the Howard Hawks version.
Yeah.
We had James Arness as sort of a
he was a space
giant living carrot is the best way I can describe it.
And how do you kill carrots? With electricity. Everyone knows that.
Yeah. But you know, it took. I think it was in Matt Smith. They finally showed you what they look like.
Right. Yeah. They took the helmet off, and it turns out that really the strange. They've done this a couple of times. They did this with the Silurians too, where the weird '70s look of the alien turned out to just be a biosuit they were wearing, and you pull it off, and they look much cooler underneath.
Yeah.
But yeah, Ice Warriors are really fun. They're great in audio. I know, not to beat that drum again, but their way of speaking is so it's like, imagine if Cobra Commander had taken a bunch of Quaaludes. They're like kind of slow and hissing all the time. Yeah, they get when there was they had a real Alien vibe too. I want to say like Alien, Ridley Scott Alien in that Gaddis episode. It's called Cold War. It's a Ice Warrior loose on a submarine.
It looks like we're going to see the first female version of one this year.
Can we talk about this? What's that double episode? The Satan Pit and forget the title of the other one.
The Impossible Planet and the Satanic
Impossible Planet.
Oh, I admit I've only
yeah,
seen
I
those
rewatched that recently, and when he goes down, way down there, into the pit, that had a very Lovecraftian look. Why don't you guys talk about those episodes for a second? I'd love your take on them.
I've been talking too much, so you guys.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, I mean, with the one episode I haven't watched again recently, but let me do a little. That's the one where David Tennant met the actual literal devil, right?
Yeah,
he was giant.
Possibly.
Yeah.
Or possibly the devil. Yeah.
There was a lot of very Lovecraftian kind of, particularly Lovecraftian space station feel to the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It was extremely eerie, and there was like this definite building sort of sense of lurking dread. And yeah, okay, in the end, it turns out to be something very much, if not actually, Satan, which is, a step away from mythos-like content. If it was Lovecraft, it would have been something much stranger than that.
Well, it's a giant humanoid with horns and a skeletal appearance.
Yeah, it's this side of in Legend. What was it? Tim Curry?
Tim Curry.
Yeah. Really looks a lot like that.
Yeah. But apart from that physical manifestation, the whole story could very easily have been a Lovecraftian thing. And the Ood are another obvious nod in Lovecraft. Maybe not a conscious and deliberate nod, but they're a definite step in the mythos direction.
Well, yeah, they look like if the traditional version of Cthulhu joined Starfleet or something. And
Yeah. Well, they're the star
spawn.
spawn of Cthulhu, aren't they?
Yeah.
Basically. And the
idea that they're always presented as a subservient sort of race that has to communicate secondhand is like, it makes them. It's a really great character concept. I wish they'd develop them a bit more.
Do either of you remember an episode? I think it was David Tennant, where there was some planet where this sort of dangerous alien wakes up every so many years, and they have to have. I think a woman sort of sing a lullaby.
Yeah, though that's the Rings of Akhenaten, I think. It's a Matt Smith episode, and I had that right on the tip of my tongue because the soundtrack is something I listen to a lot while I'm writing, and that is one of the best tracks on there. I had that was in the latter part of Smith's run, and it was one of those where the Doctor speechifies the bad guy to death eventually, or not to death, but gives a big speech and saves the day. But yeah, that was a very much almost a literal star god, where they called the power source at the center of their weird ring system grandfather, and they had to sing to it and keep it happy in a weird sort of way. But that was a very weird concept.
I found that Lovecraftian, and that it's if it wakes up ever fully, you're toast.
Oh, completely. Yeah, Akhenaten, Rings of Akhenaten, was relatively recent. Yeah, I was going to say in terms of getting into the new series, it's. I mean, I love all of the current Doctors, especially Capaldi. I think he might be my favorite of all of them. But if you're jumping in for the very, very first time and you want to start with a new series, it's hard not to recommend the beginning of Smith's run, which is season 5, because it unfortunately the new series got off to sort of a hiccup start with one season worth of Eccleston and then several seasons worth of Tennant. I mean, there's a lot of great stories there, but if you're coming in for the first time, I don't know, I would probably start with series 5.
If you start with Tennant, you're not really missing much, I don't think. You're right.
True. And weirdly, I think Eccleston holds up. Although it has that Dalek episode that Sherman wrote, which is just phenomenal. And a couple of other, Simon Pegg is in one of the first Doctor 9 episodes. But a lot of the effects and the script ideas and stuff are a bit hokier than what ended up with Tennant and Smith, which, I mean, just, I don't know, they haven't aged as well, I guess. On the other hand, they relied a lot more on, or they seem to rely a lot more on practical effects and stuff than some of the later seasons. Although, practical effects always seem to still have, even on the new series, still seem to have a lot of presence. I mean, those Zygons from Day of the Doctor and from the later Zygon episodes were pretty much guys in rubber suits, really well done rubber suits, with a bit of CG touch-up. But then, something like this, the Rings of Akhenaten, where there's a literal sentient, star that they're singing to. I can't imagine that coming off very well with old practical effects.
With this being such a long-running and history show, I would assume there's been some documentaries made about it. Is there anything particularly good or that stands out documentary-wise?
Well, if I could jump in one more time. You guys were talking about Gaddis before. Gaddis actually wrote and directed An Adventure in Space and Time, which is a dramatization of the beginning of the show. I thought was really, really well done. Has David Bradley, is that his name? Who portrayed William Hartnell as the first Doctor. And it covers basically him taking the role and covers the director, covers Verity Lambert and I can't remember the director's name, Hussein something, and how their struggles to get the show on the air and to keep it, keep it going as Hartnell was kind of, his health was getting worse. So it's in some ways it's kind of a typical Hollywood biopic, but it has some really cool stuff in it, including a really cool cameo at the end from one of the newer Doctor Who actors. I heartily recommend that. It's just TV movie length. It's like 2 hours, 2.5 hours. But as far as actual like straight up documentaries, I don't know, outside of like DVD extras and things like that. I'm not really familiar with one. There is a I haven't seen it, but there is a documentary called Dalek Mania that was on Netflix for a while. That's about an alleged, maybe Tim can talk more about this, an alleged Dalek Mania that took place in the 60s and 70s in the UK. And Terry Nation, I'm not entirely clear on all the details of this, but one of the reasons allegedly that they do a Dalek story every season is that if they don't, they'll lose the rights to the estate of Terry Nation or something, because Terry Nation half owns the Daleks or completely owns the Daleks and rents them out to the BBC, something like that.
That's true.
So anyway, that documentary allegedly talks about that, and but I haven't actually seen it. As far as things that actually cover everything from the beginning, though, I'm kind of at a loss. I really liked Adventure in Space and Time, though. I heartily recommend it. Great cast too. I mean, yeah. I've said too much.
The one that I remember, and this doesn't necessarily mean that it's particularly incredible or anything, but it's just the thing that comes to mind, was called 30 Years in the TARDIS, I think. And that was after the end of the original classic series. It was a sort of retrospective across the whole series and all the various doctors and the main characters and stuff. And it's a reasonable place to sort of stick your nose into the mythos, if you like.
Oh, it looks like the Brig narrated it.
Is that the one where at the end of the movie the monsters seem to become real? There's one I kind of remember where like the Autons are suddenly popping up and attacking Elizabeth Sladen or something like that.
Yeah, it's possible. But
if anyone was going to, they would.
I'm absolutely certain that there's going to be a list of Doctor Who documentaries out there, probably on the TARDIS data core or something.
I mean, that's where I'm looking right now. 30 Years in the TARDIS is there. It said it was originally broadcast in 1993.
Oh, cool. Good.
Speaking of
I'm
lists,
not mad then.
Google a guide to Lovecraftian themes in Doctor Who. There's a very good list of, curiously enough, Lovecraftian themes in Doctor Who.
I saw some essays.
You mentioned, what's that?
Oh, I when I was getting ready for today, I found a few essays that were talking about it. Some of them which were way too long, and almost too. They were as thorough like TV tropes as thorough, which was threatened to turn into a rabbit hole.
Well, this is more of it lists them by story, I believe, is how they're listing them. And I think you mentioned this guy Azal.
Yes.
Previously. Well, I guess he's in a story called The Demons or The Daemons.
Yes.
Does that ring a bell? And he writes, Doctor Who does not get more Lovecraftian than this story. Azal is a demonic and godlike being from the ancient past. He is identified with various mythological beings. He is worshipped by satanic cults.
And he taught the Elder Lord of Man in Atlantis, which is certainly Hellwardian, if not Lovecraftian.
Which doctor was that?
Third Doctor, John Pertwee, who used Venusian
Keto, yeah.
As Tim mentioned before, he was sort of like, I think that was the influence of Star Trek. He said, well, I can't knock out people like Mr. Spock, so I'll just do this, poke them and they get paralyzed or whatever.
Yeah, and of course Pertwee also liked to drive, so he made sure that the Doctor had a car while he was trapped on Earth.
Yeah, well, first he had a car like John Steed, which was called Betsy.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the last season, they gave him the Who-mobile to make him like Batman.
Oh, right. God, I'd forgotten about the Who-mobile. Yes, Bessie's super iconic, though. And I want to say, there was toward the end of the first run of the series, Sylvester McCoy ended up pulling Bessie out of mothballs, didn't he? At one point in that, because there was that episode where they went and there was the new Brigadier General Bambera. Remember they had and
Yeah,
Sylvester McCoy's
that
doctor
might
met
have
up with
had
the unit.
Betsy.
Yeah,
I
they did a
remember
lot of third Doctor references in that
I
one.
remember Baker used it in his first serial when they had to throw that acid on the robot or whatever it was.
Right. And his hair was.
No, I don't think this is Lovecraftian, but it's probably one of the most horrific Doctor Who stories that I've seen, and I can't remember the title. I know you guys will. It's the one that's presented in documentary style. In a way, it is.
The sleep.
You think of Blink?
No, I think he's thinking about the one with the monsters from the dust in your eyes if you don't sleep.
Yes. that was the most recent one. That was a Capaldi. Is it a Capaldi episode you're thinking of?
Yes, it's a Capaldi.
Yeah, with Reese Shearsmith from Inside Number 9 was played the mad scientist in that one. It's funny. That was I thought that was really great, but it got a lot of backlash in some of the Doctor Who forums I hang out in, because of course I hang out in Doctor Who forums.
Why would it get backlash? I thought it was brilliantly done. Even
it had a lot of build up.
Description.
I think people thought a lot of the complaints were about the ending feeling unearned because it revolved on the Doctor basically having a master plan throughout the entire thing, which is a very Sylvester McCoy thing to do. He always had master plans all ready to go. But I think they thought the ending was a bit hand wavy and unearned. I thought it was great. I love a carefully structured master plan in my time travel stories. I thought, but somebody mentioned Blink. I thought that's actually the initial one you were talking about, which is a Tennant era episode, and is one of Stephen Moffat, one of the most consistently, I think, highly rated episodes, and one of Moffat's early works before he actually took over the show.
Do we all agree that the Weeping Angels were the scariest monster on Doctor Who?
If not,
Scariest
they're right
new
up
monster.
there.
I gotta say, I don't know. The Waters of Mars are pretty freaky.
That's true too.
And it looks like they might be coming back in season 10. But yeah, the Weeping Angels definitely have I think the most shock value for sure. The silents are good too. But I think kind of like we've mentioned the Borg already in this conversation, right? And the Borg in Star Trek for me got a lot less scary the more we learned about them. And I feel like the Angels have suffered from that a little bit, and that every time they've come back, they haven't seemed quite as scary as they did the first time. But I mean, that's kind of a consistent problem with any kind of, I think, monster in media. The more you learn about them, the more you start to understand where they're coming
absolutely.
from.
Perfect example is Hannibal in Silence of the Lambs.
Exactly.
I mean, he only has 3 minutes of screen time in that film, and yet how many people walk away from it thinking he's in half the film or something, Yeah.
And then he ends up as the hero, basically, of the entire series. Although, since that did give us the Hannibal TV series, it's hard to complain too much.
I wasn't complaining.
Oh, no.
But I'm just saying, I absolutely concur with you. A lot of times, all those layers of mystery, all that distance, just makes it all that much more interesting and terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
Just like,
speaking of Blink, if someone was to say to me, just having seen the new series, I only want to watch one episode of Doctor Who, and that's it. Which episode should it be? I would say Blink. What would you guys say?
I'm with you.
Yeah, Blink's a good pick because you have the Doctor at a remove throughout the whole episode. So you don't have to, if you're never going to engage with the show again, you don't necessarily want all the required baggage, the knowledge that you have to properly make sense of the Doctor and his companion and the TARDIS and the Time Lords and blah, blah, blah. You've got a very relatable story, a very terrifying story about some people trapped in a really, really badly blighted house. And, this weird Joker figure popping up on television screens via videotapes. That's accessible.
As an honorable mention, I think the Christmas special, which had Santa Claus, and did a kind of variation on Alien.
Mm-hmm.
That was had good mixture of comedy and horror.
Yeah, I'm gonna go off script here a little bit because Blink is really, I think, easy to recommend. I want to put in a word for The Empty Child, which is a Christopher Eccleston episode with that has Jack Harkness and Rose in it, and it was Stephen Moffat's first episode. I keep throwing Moffat's name out there like everyone knows who he is. Just to be clear, Stephen Moffat is the writer producer who worked on a show called Coupling back in the day, and who took over Doctor Who after Russell T Davies, who was the one who initially brought it back, left the show. So and his run as showrunner started with Matt Smith, although he wrote a lot of stuff in the David Tennant era and the Eccleston era. The Empty Child is this really creepy, cool story set in the Blitz in London. It has some really disturbing elements. It has, I think, all the things that I think make Doctor Who great. And I don't know. I don't think it sucks necessarily to see Eccleston first if you're checking out the new series, just to see what he was like, because this was, especially at the time, this was our immediate post-war Doctor. There was no idea that there was actually a secret version of the Doctor who was wedged in between Paul McGann and Eccleston, and it's got some really great stuff. And yeah, this is the one with the little kid in the gas mask wandering around saying, "Are you my mommy?"
Very easy, very eerie episode.
Yeah.
It also
that
had
was terrifying.
It had a very unusual ending from where I thought it was going,
which
I'm glad they went that way. They said, "Oh, they're going to do this." I never saw this coming.
Yeah, and so yeah, I mean, but yeah, again, Blink though, it's hard to say no to Blink. It's hard to I like Human Nature a lot too. Although as weird as it is, it almost requires a lot more setup because you start off with the Doctor not actually being the Doctor.
Oh, you mean the one where he's in Victorian times?
The chameleon, the chameleon arch, and it's a Martha episode, and it's the first episode where they actually showed on camera all of the previous Doctors to totally confirm that there was a full connection between them. They had, because the Doctor had been transformed into a human by his chameleon arch because they were hiding out, and there was this whole backstory to it. But his mind was starting to let past lives creep through, and so he had the sketchbook and he was drawing pictures of his past selves, and at one point they showed it on camera and it had all of the previous Doctors sketched out.
Well, it actually didn't have John Hurt's.
Oh well, yeah, I mean,
we can justify that. We can justify that by saying he doesn't want to remember the Time War.
Yeah, a severe mental block. It's the only way to explain it. Oh, and again, speaking of audios, John Hurt has done 4 now. I mean, he has done, obviously won't be doing any more. But the 4th War Doctor audio was just released. So I think there's a total of 12 episodes of War Doctor audios that he did after he became ill. And it was easy for him to record audios, but not much else. So yeah, shout out for that. Those War Doctor stories are really great.
Was John Hurt ever on the television show?
Yes.
Yeah.
He was.
Oh yeah.
Really?
He was introduced.
Played the Doctor.
Well, I'll let you guys explain it.
Tim, you want it, or should I take it?
Yeah,
well, I mean, he was sort of shuffled on stage as part of one of the specials, basically.
But he was a secret incarnation of the Doctor.
The idea was that the Doctor couldn't basically handle what he had to do in the Time War, so he doesn't consider himself the Doctor during that time period, and that's the time period when he was John Hurt.
So this was a one-off episode.
Right.
Kinda, yeah. In much the same way McGann only had the TV movie and then a short film, John Hurt appeared at the tail end of one episode as a sudden revelation. Oh my God, this was one of the Doctors. And then he, in some ways, he kind of filled in for Christopher Eccleston in the 50th anniversary special. As I understand it, the script had originally been written for Doctors 9, 10, and 11 to team up and save the day. And Eccleston refused to come back for whatever reason, and so they created John Hurt to fill in for him. And he was awesome. I mean, it's a little awkward having to explain all the math and everything, but if you hand wave it enough and just accept John Hurt as being the Doctor, he's really good.
The problem that it causes is you got to renumber the Doctors from how you.
Right.
So Christopher Eccleston becomes number 10 rather than number 9.
Except they don't really. They still count Capaldi as the 12th and Smith as
Right.
the 11th. For
Yeah, they call John Hurt the War Doctor. So
yeah. And they count him as a regeneration as well as Tennant's hand regeneration at one point, because that's how they end up with Smith running out of regenerations, which is a whole thing.
Yeah.
There's an awful lot of hand waving throughout Doctor Who continuity, and that's just how it is. That's just how it is. It's so complex and so crazy, and it's been going on for so long. You need a legion of dedicated continuity experts behind the show who've been working on it. There's no hope. There's always going to be hand waving.
Kind of, again, reminds me of Lovecraft and the
totally.
Lovecraft mythos. I mean, in that there have been so many different people who've worked in Doctor Who, worked within Doctor Who, the milieu of Doctor Who, and during the wilderness years between the main series, there were people writing novels and writing audio stories where they just went all kinds of places. There's a whole stretch of Paul McGann's stories before the new series came back where he's in a whole different universe that doesn't even have time as a concept. So he's a man with a time machine and no ability to travel through time, and it's just nuts.
Well, in some of the Virgin book stuff, you have this kind of, after they lose the license thing with the Berenice Summerfield stuff, they start taking the character who they can no longer name, and they turn him into basically this evil god who's controlling this pocket universe that includes the Earth and everything that we know, with an iron fist as a tyrant. And it's a very easy switch to see the Doctor move from that sort of benevolent, happy-go-lucky, let's save London again, to, in fact, this basically is Nyarlathotep. Let's take the gloves off. This is what he is.
Mm-hmm. At the end of the Waters of Mars, he definitely goes in that direction.
I'm Lord Victorious. Well, and of course, we haven't even talked about the Valeyard.
Yes, totally.
We might as well talk about the Valeyard. You want to go with that?
Sure.
Well, the Valeyard is it's kind of funny. He's one of those concepts like the previous Doctors from the Mobius. I can never remember. The idea is he's a version of the Doctor, but he's kind of an alternate future version of the Doctor. When he was initially introduced, basically he would have been, I think he would have been the 12th Doctor. But the character conceptually was an excuse for a clipisode in the Colin Baker era. Colin Baker's run had a lot of trouble with the BBC, as I understand it. Maybe Tim can speak more to that. But they weren't particularly fond of Colin Baker, and so a lot of his seasons and series were abridged. And one of them, one entire season was taken up by something called Trial of a Time Lord, which is kind of a whole lot of clips where this guy called the Valeyard puts the Doctor on trial once again for breaking the laws of time and changing things and that sort of thing. And it's revealed eventually, spoiler, that the Valeyard is a future incarnation of the Doctor who's trying to steal the 6th Doctor's regenerations for himself, which is a totally circuitous, like, I don't even know how that would work idea. Because if you steal them from your 6th self, how do you still have them when you're the 12th? So, but ultimately that was retconned as to be that the Valeyard was a possible offshoot or an amalgamation of all of the Doctor's evil side, kind of given form, and trying to steal the regenerations that way, which kind of makes more plot sense.
But the Jungian shadow, basically.
Yeah. And there have been a few
Doctor.
times where it seemed like they might touch on that again. There was a great Matt Smith episode featuring a character called the Dream Lord, which was played by Toby, what's his name from the Detectorists, played Hitchcock. Toby Jones. Thank you, SP. SP's still here, by the way. She could connect. But yeah, Toby Jones ends up sort of a concentration of all the Doctor's dark half, and who is trying to manipulate him psychologically and stuff. And there's been some theorizing in the Gallifrey subreddit and various other places that is a character that could eventually evolve into the Valeyard. Because the thing about the Valeyard is he was supposed to have appeared between, I think, the Doctor's 12th and 13th incarnations, or 11th and 12th, one of those.
Or his last incarnation in death.
Yes, yes. So between his 12th and last is how is said, right?
Yeah.
And so really, he could come along anytime. I haven't. I know he's actually appeared in the audios a few times, but I haven't actually heard any of those. There's a whole series called Trial of the Valeyard, but he was actually mentioned. Richard E. Grant, as the Great Intelligence, mentioned the name Valeyard in one of them in the Snowmen, I think, as one of the names that the Doctor is known by.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, and it's fine. I've tried to figure out where that name came from because it's just Valeyard. It's just cool, right? They completely made it up. It looks like I haven't been able to find any kind of historical record of what a Valeyard is. It basically means a Time Lord prosecutor who wears a funny pointy hat.
The Time Lords went from being the Watchers to then being, let's say, the good version of the Vorlons in Babylon 5, though that predates them, and then they became evil.
Although, are the Vorlons really evil, or are they just doing their?
The Vorlons
That's a whole other show.
They became more like the CIA.
Yeah.
In Cold War fiction, in fact, there was a.
Are you talking about the Celestial Intervention Agency, or?
Yeah, I was going to say there was a division of the Time Lords which was interfering, which was literally the CIA.
Yeah.
Well, before we get too low on time, do you guys want to throw out any more Lovecraftian influences in Doctor Who stories? Anything that you think are especially noteworthy? By the way, while you're thinking about that, I looked up that audio I mentioned earlier, and it's read by David Tennant. It's Doctor Who: The Nightmare of Black Island, and I thought it was pretty good. So, on a lonely stretch of Welsh coastline, a fisherman is killed by a hideous creature from beneath the waves. Mayhem. So
there was one episode, and I think the title was "The Curse of Fenric," which was a Sylvester McCoy episode, which had this monstrous alien from outer space. It was the basis for the wolf Fenris in Norse mythology. And somehow he was controlling vampires from the future who looked like the creature from the Black Lagoon.
Right. Yeah, the Curse of Fenric is a great story, and I think Battlefield is as well. The Seventh Doctor had a lot of that kind of deep history stuff going on, where it seemed that they were really trying to, with Sylvester McCoy, if they would have kept going, they were going to give him a much deeper historic backstory. I think it's Battlefield implies that he basically was Merlin.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
Like the Arthurian Merlin, and left messages for himself as the Seventh Doctor. So yeah, definitely a lot of the Sylvester McCoy stuff, and he often appeared in the novels, in the novelizations during between the series too, as a character who was touching upon those themes. I wanted to throw out a shout out to the horror of Fang Rock, which is a really it's a very Hammer horror-y sort of kind of gothic horror episode with Tom Baker and Leela. And involves a lighthouse on a seacoast and a horrible jellyfish type monster. There's some telepathic stuff, if memory serves. It's a pretty cool story if you're interested in the confluence between Doctor Who and horror. And in many ways, they kind of a lot of Doctor Who seems to reflect what was popular culturally at the time. So Tom Baker's stuff, especially his early 70s stuff, feels a lot of Dark Shadows Hammer kind of influence, whereas later it starts to feel a little more sci-fi as he gets into the later 70s. And you can kind of watch that in Baker's run too, because his run is still the longest of any of the Doctors in terms of stories produced, not counting Paul McGann. That's audio only and stuff.
You had mentioned there's 10 seasons of this, and this show's been around since apparently 10
seasons of the new series.
Oh, I was going to say. Oh, okay.
It's like 27 of classic, I think.
The old series lasted from 63 to 89.
So these series you know, it's not like it's over in March and we get a new one in September. There are gaps and stuff.
Sure. In the
Sometimes,
original, yeah, there was the sometimes called the wilderness years. The big gap was between 1989, which was the end of Sylvester McCoy's run, kind of. Then there and the new series started in, I want to say, 2003 or is 2005.
2005.
And but in between there was the Paul McGann TV movie in 1996, which was an attempt to kind of reboot the show with Fox. So a lot of it was set in the United States, and Seventh Doctor was killed in a hail of bullets in a gang shooting because, of course, that's what happened in the 90s.
You may not consider this part of canon, but in 1993 there was a special called Dimensions in Time.
Yes, that's true.
Which had Doctors 3 through 7 battling the Rainey, who's an evil female Time Lord, played by Kate O'Mara, who's from the Hammer horror movies, who had been a recurring character. And it was a crossover, was of all things the East Enders soap opera.
Right.
Which you probably know. I mean, I recognize some of the actors from other things, but that was an unusual crossover. It was like it would have been like having Star Trek crossover with Dallas is probably the closest.
Yeah, exactly like that. Except there was never any glamour in EastEnders.
Favorite Doctor?
Tom Baker.
Same here.
Me too.
I love all of them in their own way, but honestly, I love Capaldi, the current Doctor. I really do. I think he's brought something to the part that is like equal parts youthful and old and crazy and incredibly Scottish.
Now,
Capaldi is a glorious actor. Definitely.
Yes.
He's wonderful. But the Forgotten Doctor is Peter Cushing. You can see his 2 movies on YouTube. Doctor Who.
How do you feel about the idea that those are in-universe movies that are produced about a guy named Doctor Who? Have you heard that?
Right. I mean, the thing that's difficult, his family name is Who. He's just some eccentric professor who has the most brilliant mind in the whole universe.
I think he's the only Doctor with a mustache, too.
Yeah.
I always liked the idea that the Peter Cushing movies were actually written by the Brigadier at UNIT.
Yes.
Yes. He just wrote these things as a kind of sly homage to his friend, and that they're movies that Doctor Who himself could see. I always liked that idea.
Do you remember who plays the policeman in the second movie?
No.
Bernard Crippins.
Oh, really?
It was Donna Noble's grandfather.
Yeah, he's the reason that the 10th Doctor had to regenerate.
Right. The reason they brought him back was because he had been in Doctor Who, second Doctor Who movie.
With all these various doctors, and of course now being an expat, and I get exposed to all kinds of European stuff, the Europeans are so far ahead of us as far as women's issues. Has there been a female doctor?
Not yet.
Not yet.
It's an ongoing fight.
Interestingly, the Master recently, and spoilers, this basically spoils all of season 8 for you, but the first Capaldi season, a female incarnation of the Master, who is often presented as the kind of the yin to the Doctor's yang, is played by Michelle Gomez, and she's still around. She goes by Missy, which is short for the Mistress. And there was Tim, did you ever see Curse of Fatal Death?
I did.
Yeah, it was the first writing for Doctor Who that Stephen Moffat ever did, and it's the one with Rowan Atkinson playing the Doctor. So this was during this was after Paul McGann. So technically, Atkinson was the first Ninth Doctor, or one of the first Ninth Doctors, and so it's really funny. It's really well written. It's about 15 minutes long. You can find this on YouTube. Jonathan Pryce plays the Master, and throughout the course of the story, the Doctor ends up regenerating rapid fire like 3 or 4 times, and he goes through a lot of different celebrities like Jim Broadbent and Hugh Grant and so forth, but ends up as Joanna Lumley. who I'm sure everyone is familiar with from Absolutely Fabulous and the Avengers and various other things in which she's awesome.
Sapphire and Steel. Which really to be
yes, which I really need to watch.
She would have made. I mean, he's probably too old for it now, but she would have made a great doctor.
Yeah. So there's been a lot of talk about the Capaldi has announced that his last season will be season 10, and there's been a lot of talk about whether we will actually get a female doctor, because Moffat seems to have been doing everything he possibly can to lay the groundwork for it. And the guy taking over the show is Chris Chibnall, who is the showrunner on Broadchurch, which stars David Tennant. It's a detective series set.
It's a great Broadchurch is a great
fantastic
show.
So that's the guy taking over Doctor Who for series 11, and I personally think Olivia Colman would make a fantastic Doctor.
Tilda Swinton.
Tilda Swinton would be, if you could get her to do TV. That's why I think Coleman might work out better, because she's worked so much on television and with Chibnall. But yeah, Tilda Swinton would be fantastic. I think, but the real question, to get back to your question, Joe, I mean, I think it really depends on how willing they are to go there. You know, it'll inevitably be incredibly controversial, whether you want it to be or not. And I imagine it probably might even be more controversial in the States than it would be in the UK.
I can see it being controversial in the States, but here, I mean, we see women in lead roles. One of the things I love in so much European television is when we see police, when we see first responders or just housewives, people look like people. That woman, her hips are big, you know? That woman, she's starting to double chin. This guy, you know, he's not young and handsome. We see and all amazingly talented actors, but they look like real fucking people.
Hey, I have a comment about the woman character. In the U.S., there's a version of Sherlock Holmes on Elementary, and John Watson is Jane Watson. And no one's kicked up any fuss at all, as far as I could tell. They just enjoy the show because it's Lucy Liu.
It's a great show.
That actually goes back to a George C. Scott movie called They Might Be Giants, which had a
Well, that was a really good
asylum believing
Thanks
was
for
home
reminding me.
And Watson was Paul Newman's wife. Can't remember her name. But they had a female Dr. Watson in that.
Woodward? Joanne Woodward?
Yeah, Joanne Woodward was Dr. Watson.
Oh, I never saw that. But I'm a big fan of They Might Be Giants, but I haven't seen the actual movie that took their name from. I mean, a lot of it also comes down to, I mean, I don't know how this is perceived in the UK, but I would, if it was on an American network, Doctor Who would totally be like a cash cow for that particular network that they would be leery of making too many changes with, you know. So I could see there being a resistance to having anything other than a male, or, I mean, I suspect it might be more likely we get a black Doctor Who before we got a female Doctor Who, but I don't know.
Well, you know,
England's been ruled by women for on and off for hundreds of years.
Oh yeah.
I
And
mean,
to be clear, I think it's a great idea. I would love to see someone like Leonard Swinton.
Well, Doctor Who makes a lot of money for the BBC.
That are women.
Yeah. Doctor Who makes a lot of money for the BBC, and it makes a lot of money in the States. I think the UK, there'd be some, you know, diehard bigots who grumbled about it. But I don't think the UK would be up in arms with a female Doctor. But I think the US would explode. All those internet fans, all those forums, they'd go incandescent. And it's a very important show for the BBC.
One of the things I see on social media is when it comes to comic fans, when it comes to horror fans, when it comes to geek culture in general, women are fans, women are intelligent, women are consuming and enjoying and contributing to all this stuff. It's not just guys anymore.
And I think
that's not what I'm saying. I'm not suggesting that the audience is male. I'm suggesting that the male audience is pretty toxic.
Well,
a
they
large
need to
chunk of it.
remove their heads from their asses, then, don't they?
They could definitely
Yes,
go
but
full
that's
Gamergate.
expensive.
Well,
That's an expensive piece of education you're charitably dishing out there.
Well, don't you
Personally, I'd love to see it. I'd love to see a female doctor. I'd love to see a black doctor. And let's bring Martha back as the next doctor.
Okay, maybe
I mean, I'm
maybe
just finally got to see it.
but
Matt,
don't you think that it would be that'd be like Much Ado, a Tempest in a Teapot, and the more general consuming audience would just say, "Hey, sure, bring it on."
I think
ultimately
it's going to come down to story. You know, that's what it's going to come down to.
Yeah, I just
Whoever the
finally
doctor
got
is.
to see Doctor Strange.
Mhm.
And I thought Tilda Swinton was brilliant. Of course, I'm biased as hell, but she was brilliant. I wouldn't trade her for anything, for anybody else in that role.
Yeah, well, and to your point about the fandom, Joe, I think I literally have a couple of friends who have given up on Doctor Who because despite the treatment of female characters, despite the various companions and everything, simply because they were tired of once the possibility of a female doctor was raised, that not actually happening, because they feel like they're not giving the opportunity to feel like they're the hero of the show. These are gamer friends, obviously, and that kind of thing, but it's giving everyone somebody to identify with as the hero of the show is not a bad thing. But also, I mean, I hear what you're saying about it being such a cash cow for the BBC and such a central thing. It could seriously cause an outsized, I think, controversy. I mean, look at how much trouble small groups of toxic, usually white straight guys online have been able to cause in so many places. I mean, I don't want to get too political, but I mean, just like look at Gamergate, look at elections, look at the Hugos. It's that kind of thing crops up everywhere, and I would hate to see it visibly infect Who fandom, but I worry that would happen. I don't know.
Well, I think the UK fandom won't have any problem because they did all the controversial stuff on Torchwood.
True. But again, it's a separate thing, though. Torchwood is not Doctor Who. Even it's an acronym of Doctor Who, but it's not. The actual.
Tim?
Well, but I mean, they went in directions that I was surprised how far they went.
I don't remember Torchwood as coming over as particularly controversial in the UK. Some people liked it, some people didn't, but it seemed to basically come down to how irritating they personally found John Barrowman. I enjoyed it. I thought it was fun. I don't remember any great controversy about it, though. And the thing is that these decisions, particularly for something like Doctor Who, they're going to be made at the end by people who hold purse strings. And the people in charge of money are not known for their artistic bravery in general.
Yeah, that's true.
So I'm not sure if we're going to see it anytime soon. I hope we do, but I'm not holding my breath.
I see so much of what the BBC produces as far as miniseries and whatnot. I have a tendency to think that they're more artistic than Hollywood. So, I'm just dreaming.
Well, getting back to Capaldi, I just wanted to say about him that I warmed up to him rather quickly with the episode of Listen. Wasn't that an incredibly good episode?
Yeah.
Very theatrical in a weird sort of. Was that the one that opens with him doing the monologue directly to the camera about perfect hiding?
Yeah.
And it felt very much like it had a similar feel to Blink and some of the other spookier episodes. But yeah, that was really well done.
I'm going to take back my if there was only one episode and say Listen over Blink, because I'm such a fan of that episode.
Yeah, that's really well done.
I just want to just to get back to the previous discussion. There's always a way they could cheat at this. And the way is, like just as Marvel Comics used to injure the hero when somebody took over the mantle, we've got a doctor who's got a granddaughter and a clone daughter running around in the universe somewhere.
own daughter, who was played by an actress who was the daughter of the 5th Doctor and who was married to the 10th Doctor.
Right.
And, so.
I mean, you could easily, have the Doctor gets zapped into another dimension by the Daleks, and a new Doctor has to arise, and it's his daughter or his granddaughter or already established in continuity.
Yeah. What's her name? The actress who played Susan has done a lot of audio stories.
Carol Ann Ford.
Carol Ann Ford, yeah. There's a story called An Earthly Child, not Unearthly Child, but An Earthly Child, where McGann's doctor goes back and meets her and meets his great-grandson, who is Susan's son. It's a pretty good story. I think it's a Christmas story, actually.
What is this?
Go ahead, Rick. Sorry.
Just one last. Tim, what's the spin-off they're going to do based on the school where...
Oh, yeah, the Demon Headmaster stuff. I don't know huge details, but I know that they're bringing Tony Head back from the school where they had Sarah Jane and Rose meeting up.
Really?
That's cool.
That's great.
I don't know how deeply it's going to be tied into Doctor Who continuity.
Well,
but anything with... Well, yes, but I don't know how much it's going to be tied into ongoing TARDIS-related stuff, whether it's all going to be focused on the school or whatever. But anything with Tony Head and it's going to be wonderful. What else do you need to say?
Yeah.
SP and I saw a production of Peter Pan. The only time we went to London together in 2003, we saw Tony Head playing Captain Hook in a production of Peter Pan. Which
fantastic.
Well, you'd think so. That was quite an experience, and I probably don't have enough time to go into all the details. But he wore a black leather jacket and had a hook that looked like a scythe, and he didn't sing.
Oh, what a shame.
Well, yeah, we are pretty much out of time. Thanks, guys, for being on the show. This was fun.
Thank you.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Bye.
Next week, we're going to have... who are we going to have next week? Derek Hussey from Hippocampus Press is going to be on the show. So, yeah, prizes. Thanks, Matt. We're giving away... Prize, Matt?
I have a copy of the paperback anthology, Heroes of Red Hook.
Okay. Heroes of Red Hook. And then I've got a copy from of Awaiting Strange Gods by Daryl Schweitzer and Darkness, My Old Friend by John Peelin. If you want those, send an email to lovecrafteasingprizes@gmail.com and put the title of the book in the subject and whatever you want to say on the body of the email. It's always nice to get a note if you like the show. Let us know. So you can also send an email directly, not for prizes, because you won't be entered. You can, if you want to email the show, it's lovecrafteasing@gmail.com. So thanks everybody for listening, and we will see you next week.